Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I will be doing a psychotherapy session in the depth, in the pursuit of creating now a newer relationship model based on our understanding of our current state of affairs. And based on the current state of affairs of the relationship model we see between specifically men and women, in the understanding of how the current relationship model might sit, we can then analyze or specifically create a healing as a result of going through the thought process. Now, in the nature of this particular video, I will give a fair warning right now that this video may be of a trigger nature in its analysis in order to essentially expose where the trauma sits. And now, in understanding where the trauma sits in the relationship based off of man and woman, I will now undo the hypnosis, if you wish, where we then begin the dive into the realm of the relationships between man and woman. Now, as I dive into the story, I must return back once again into the story where creation occurs, which is where we find the fundamental stance and the nature in between where we find the true relationship between man and woman, which is at Adam and Eve. Now, see, at Adam and Eve, we see the story of the temptation of the snake resulting in man then consuming the fruit of knowledge based on the temptation that which was presented by Eve. And the analysis of this particular story, I will be then further pursuing the analysis based off of the woman's perspective in order to gain the man's perspective. Now, in analyzing the second creation, which is woman, which relates back in her not just physiological but psychology process based back upon the initial input of man. In understanding this particular perspective, you could say now, in understanding a woman, beyond the point of her first taking of innocence, which for women, a taking of innocence is in essence of a physical property. When you look at the virginity of a woman, you would see its physical property. And in the virginity of a woman, you would also see where woman struggles in accepting once her innocence has been taken away from her. And the idea that a man creates the input at which the woman reacts from, which in the more you stimulate the reaction of the woman, you could essentially say you create a stepping stone like reaction mechanism, which the more you step, all of a sudden you see more and more excitements arise, which means more temptations. Now, out of the temptation itself as a man, you might see yourself as a groomer at this particular point. So let's continue into the analysis of the behavior of the woman, which in understanding the core basis behind feeling love and in the experience of feeling love is also the notion that if in order to feel love, you need a certain liquid courage in order to be more yourself, in order to feel that form of love, such as a substance, if you wish, the fruit. If in order to feel love, you need a increase in the level of the substance as a woman, then you could see that once man removes the substance of his love, also known as the grooming he has towards you, you would then see that once I remove man, you are then left with your innocence taken away from you. But you also see the substance which results in you feeling love, now resulting in you seeking to find love in the same way. In the perversion of woman, however, according to the partners that which she now finds attractive to her liking, if in understanding the attraction of mating for a female requires a man to be of a certain bad boy-like nature, you would see then that upon the first initial section of the woman's taking of innocence, her losing of virginity, you would then see the first initial, you could say, onset of her self-discovery, which is the onset of the spiritual aspect that Carl Jung discusses in the notion that in order to be illuminated, you do not imagine figures of light, but you simply make the darkness conscious first. And so in the beginning of the spiritual journey for woman, based upon her first initial taking of innocence, you would then see that her first love was her truest love. Because every partner beyond that point in the arc, which as we go in through the arc, we will see where the journey creates an upward change, which will allow us to understand the behavior of man better when we go beyond the arc of the woman. Now, in understanding the particular darkness you are now entering, which means you as a young woman are now creating, essentially, you are seeking a more bad and badder partner upon every single partner you will be passing or going through in your experience of self-discovery at that particular point. And the worse and worse a partner gets, the worse and worse the substance use gets, the worse and worse sexual proclivity gets, until you essentially get to a breakdown point as a woman. You have been completely used up and you reached the breaking point, which is now where you find the arc of stepping towards the light. You see, in the notion of inviting Christ into your marriage, this is a notion that is meant to emanate for the woman. In the understanding of inviting Christ into the marriage, you would then see that there are different partners for different forms of love for a woman, which inviting Christ into the marriage is essentially when you create a trio. In the trio of things, now imagine that from the arc of the woman where she has now gone through her darkness, she has gone through her stage of self-discovery where in her breaking point, she finds she has experienced enough darkness and it is no longer thrilling at this point, it is simply degenerating to experience the darkness at the rate that which you as woman might be or have experienced, and then you see where your beginning portion of your upward swing in your arc would ensue. Now, in the portion of things where at the moment you then accept, I have undergone enough darkness to discover myself, essentially, to put it quite simply, a woman is the mother of all men, which means if a woman is the mother of all men, and I will bring this back into the notion of Christ in a second, if a woman is the mother of all men, how can she know which man's son she may have brought into the world if she herself has not met every single man? Which invites the idea of accepting divine femininity. In understanding divine femininity, you would understand that it is in the darkness of the process of the self-discovery of the woman where the woman felt the most alive in her life. Which means in the more negative and negative and negative we take the analysis of the sexual proclivity beyond the taking of the first point of innocence, you would then see that the woman's behavior first dives in a much deeper path, which we arrive now at the breaking point, which woman is still healing to this day. In the breaking point of things, a woman then realizes that she is essentially the mother of all men. Which means from her, all men come from. In the play on words, if you wish to put it in a light manner, a woman is that which all men come from. Which, when we understand the divine femininity of things, we would see then that in the darkness of her self-exploration, she then found that all men come from her. And it is now when she is now able to identify one that she may see as the man she wishes for the rest of her life. Upon making the character arc of seeking all men to then seeking one man. Notice in the analysis I have driven the notion behind the dark experience that women endure in the idea of fulfilling the man's wants and not hers. But in the notion of fulfilling the man's wants, you would then see that the man's wants are her wants and her needs. In the taking of innocence, the darker the path of the woman has gone, the darker you must begin igniting her from. As a man, if you are not able to do so, you would then essentially understand that in the process of the woman's self-discovery in her spiritual journey beyond the first taking of her innocence, she is ultimately chasing a greater and greater and greater release until she no longer has the ability to release because the perversion has gone to that level of darkness, resulting in the mental breakdown, where now she feels a rewiring towards a light. To put it simply, in order for a woman to stop her sexual proclivity, she must get it out of her system, where she now finds the ability to say, I am ready to stick to one particular man. Now, as man, that entire story is based on your first taking of innocence, which if you have a daughter now, you would realize the depth at which other men may take her taking of innocence. which will create the initial spiritual journey. And as a father, what can you do? As a loving partner, what can you do? As the first or last or every other partner in between, what can you do? Because see, all of this sexual behavior is as a result of your first input towards the woman, which in its essence, in the understanding of divine femininity, we then find the essence of divine masculinity. In the nature of divine masculinity, we see it of a saint-like nature, which would mean or invoke the idea of a understanding nature, of a perspective, of a higher perspective. Which now you yourself see as a man that in your exploration of yourself, upon the initial beginning portion of inducing the fruit in pursuit of temptation to essentially pursue the taking of innocence, you would then see the divine masculine. If the taking of innocence is what creates the divinity of the divine femininity, known as the beginning of her spiritual journey in her self-discovery, then the taking away of innocence in essence could be said the same for man. It is simply who takes what and who gives what at that particular point, where we see the transfer of divine masculinity. And the divine masculinity of things, your wants are her wants, and your wants will become her needs. Which means as a man, if you have darkness or anger that which you want to take out in forms of perversion, you would then see that the woman's behavior is as a result of your first input as a man. Which now, as we see the hatred we now see in modern feminism, which woman is saying, we don't need men. And in that understanding, we're going to dive now into the mentality of why women don't need men. And we will then reflect the thought back into why men don't need women. In the analysis going forward, you as a man create the first taking of innocence, which means you are a taker of innocence, whereas a woman is a taken of innocence. And in being a taker of innocence, you essentially have to basically create a way that you can slow down the way you take the innocence away. In the pursuit of sexual proclivity is also the thrill of the addiction, where you become like a junkie. And in the taking away of innocence at a rapid rate, you would then see that based as your first stimulus or first input as a man towards a woman, you are actively creating a greater and greater and greater pull within herself. The more you create another temptation, another, you could say, release, which requires more and more and more dominance over the woman, which results in the taking of innocence. If a man is not dominant, the woman does not release from her taking of innocence. And from her taking of innocence, if she does not release, she does not find him a suitable partner. which means as a man, you must now invite the notion in your life that you are a taker of innocence, and in a consensual way, of course, if we wish to invite the idea of consent now. Because now let's step back into the stage or the era of the woman. Because see, most women or all women have a story of sexual assault, or also known as rape, a non-consensual act of taking away innocence. And in this particular notion is where she feels the less in control over her taking of innocence, based on the level of the taker of innocence. And based on this particular notion, you would then see that upon the initial trauma, the taking of innocence, if the first input of taking away of innocence is of such a dark nature, you would then see that the sexual proclivity at which the woman begins her journey into darkness can start much deeper into darkness, which creates now a much darker complex within the woman, creating a much bigger hatred for woman towards man. And yet in her hatred towards man, in order to feel her release, she will only experience the release based on her taking of innocence when she feels no longer in control. Which then results in degenerative and dehumanizing actions in order to fulfill the idea of a release, which is all human behavior in the end. Everything is perfectly acceptable. We have zero moral compass as to what is acceptable to allow to happen to a human, or so we're told. Because a moral compass is, in essence, a societal construct. But notice I'm not placing the blame here towards woman, I am placing it upon you as a man. Because you're the first input. And based on the poorly comprehensible level of not just your emotional but logical intelligence, you then experience what is known as impatience. And in your impatience, you could actively say you have become of a gentle nature, because you are not dominant enough in a consensual way, which now results in you as an individual pushed away. Because woman is saying in her discovery of self, and this is where the arc of man stems from, in her discovery of self, you as a good man might now see yourself not in the discussion within her act of self-discovery in her spiritual journey, because the greatest fear of a woman is to be judged upon her darkness, based on her darkness, and to be judged by a good man who himself was not able to be dominant enough at the time she was discovering herself. But now you find her approach you, now that she has made her character arc. And you are now faced with your emotional or logical intelligent choice, which you as a man, if you wanted the girl back then but were simply not dominant enough, that she would have chosen you back then, but she is now choosing you now because she is seeking a comfort, a partner of comfort to start a family with. She is no longer driven by her spiritual discovery, which is in her act of accepting her self-expression known as her taking away of innocence. But now you arrive here as a man, and she presents herself before you. You might say, no thank you. That would be logical. But from an emotional standpoint, you must now dive into your own self-discovery as a man. Why were you not dominant when she, or when you could have been dominant? Resulting in now your pain and your suffering as a good man because you could not simply just be dominant enough. And now she presents herself to you, and very well in understanding your answer of being a good man, if you are now to say yes to her, you see that you take her pain away. Because this is the moment you become her protector. As a good man, this is why women want a good man in the end, because you become her protector. She has undergone enough evil in her spiritual journey of experiencing her spiritual expression, which releases her from her first taking away of innocence. And in the depth of finding herself, she then finds that she is now officially in danger. Because if she does not stop this proclivity, it's going to result in the taking of her life, in the exception, or in the ascension, or the progressive pattern of the darkness that the sexual proclivity might take place in. Which now, if the darker the place goes, eventually she reaches her breaking point. Which now, as a good man, here you are with the woman you would have wanted all of those years ago. But because you were not dominant enough, you could not achieve her then. But now she presents herself willingly to you. And in being a good man comes the emotional understanding that because you were not dominant back then, she didn't choose you. But through the anger that which you essentially evolved through in your time alone, while she experienced her spiritual darkness with the evil, the bad boys, she now sees her character arc where she arrives at now you, the good man. And you have the ability to essentially take her suffering away from her, because that is a woman you would have wanted back then, and you didn't because you were not dominant enough. You are now placed with the decision: do you choose to end her suffering and begin protecting her for the rest of your life? Which now you see the transfer of pain in her emotional state changes from her heart and then enters yours. You take her suffering away from her. And in being a good man, you enter a deeper level of suffering all of a sudden. Because in knowing that you were not dominant enough the entire time you would have wanted her, and now she has come to you to seek protection, and accepting taking her pain away and protecting her, you also accept and swallow your pride back and realize that you were not her first true love, but you love her nonetheless. In the beginning of the video, I talk about how there is going to be a bit of emotional pain within this video. This is a moment you could actively see where both man and woman now might feel a level of pain within themselves. Because we are essentially pointing the finger back and forth at each other saying, this is all your fault. And we are actively saying, I don't need you in my life if that's the case. Where now we see the divide between man and woman, which is the divide that's been present since the beginning of time. A man and a woman naturally do not coexist together. They do not do so willingly. They do it by choice, because they choose to come together. And in the accepting of the coming together, you as a man must realize you are not dominant enough. You as a woman might realize how far down in the darkness you might have gone based on the idea that the man was not dominant enough, and you pursue the idea of seeking for him to gain his dominance by creating an anger in him so that he may be more dominant, creating the competition between men for the mate. And if a man is not dominant enough, you become the last selection, which according to your perception of either emotional or logical intelligence, you would either see that as the best or the worst thing. If you see it from the best perspective, you could actively say, well, you're just that nice of a person. If you see it from the perspective of the worst thing, you could still see it from the perspective of you're that nice of a person. Because ultimately, you as a man must realize that you are a taker of innocence, and a woman is a taken of innocence. In Hebrew, it is spoken that the female incarnation within the human experience is the toughest incarnation within the universe prior to entering heaven. We might see a particular reason why, because of this dark spiritual journey, which you as men might not understand the darkness at which this particular experience is truly deeply rooted in. And in this particular experience, you might see yourself in the experience of the man. Pardon my dogs. Now, in the experience of the man, if you see it from a negative perspective, you will gain anger, resulting in you now becoming more dominant, resulting in you now being the man she needed you to be all this time. And now you as a man might say, you came to me when it just didn't even feel like you actually really cared. And you just used me at that particular point to seek protection.